Okay, it's time to start another round of reviews with the Pokemon Professor. Today we're going to be looking at the coordinate plane. The coordinate plane, they're just number lines. Do you remember when we talked about number lines? So remember, a number line is just a picture. It's a representation of numbers. And what's really important is to understand that they have equal intervals, equal distances between consecutive numbers. So the distance between 1 and 2 is the same as 2 and 3. And this is very important when we get to talking about coordinate planes. Now, here's a sample of a number line. And here we have 2 points, point 1 and a point at -2. Now, what happens if we start looking at stacking points, or we start looking at points that are above and below the line? Well, it could look like this. All of a sudden, I now have 3 points above the line, above 1, and I have 3 points below the line at -2. And as I start to see points that end up above and below the line, I'm no longer just looking at points along one direction. I'm now looking at points along 2 directions. So now we have to bring in another number line in order to help us with distances above or below the number line. And that's when we get to the coordinate plane. So we still have our horizontal number line, just like we saw in the last example, and we call this the x-axis. We also have a vertical number line now. This is the y-axis. So we assign the variable x to the horizontal distance we travel across the horizontal line. But now when we're talking about distances above or below that horizontal line, we use a new variable called y to talk about those distances. Now, of course, the coordinate plane is usually the x-axis and y-axis. It can vary. There are other variables that can be related to each other on the coordinate plane that you learn about as you go through physics or higher level math classes. But for now, the x-axis and y-axis serves our purposes for an Algebra 1 course. Now, here's some things you have to notice about this. First, where do the 2 lines intersect? Where do they cross? Well, if you notice, there is a spot where they do in fact cross, which is the origin. The origin is one of our key locations on the coordinate plane. Now, there's something else that these axes do. Notice that because they intersect at 0, they also represent a change. So the y-axis represents the place where the x-axis changes from positives to negatives. So to the right, the x-axis is the positive x-axis. That's another important region. There are certain characteristics of the points on that region. To the left of the y-axis, that's the negative x-axis. And all of the numbers on that side are going to be negative. And notice, because this is on the x-axis, that the y-coordinates in both of those locations will always be 0, because that corresponds to 0 on the y-axis. Now, the same thing is true with how the x-axis works as the transition point for the y-axis. Above the x-axis, we have our positive numbers, our positive y-axis, and below, we have our negative y-axis. And again, each of those 2 regions are important because in each of those 2 regions, above, the numbers are always positive and the x-coordinate is 0. Below are always negative y values and the x-coordinate 0. So far I've talked about 5 important areas of the coordinate plane. There's where the 2 axes cross, which is the origin, and how each of these axes breaks the other into a positive side and a negative side. Now, the axes also break up the plane that they're sitting in into 4 quadrants. And these 4 quadrants are 4 other regions where there are similarities. So in quadrant 1, both the x coordinates and y coordinates will both be positive. Quadrant 2, negative x coordinates but positive y. That's because you're to the left of the y-axis and above the x-axis. Quadrant 3 is negative x and negative y, below and to the left. And quadrant 4 is a positive x and a negative y, below and to the right. So these are the total, that makes 9 important regions for the coordinate plane that each have their own sort of characteristics. So if I go back to my previous example, I started with a dot at 1, and then I had a dot above it. Well, if I look, because I now have a y-axis to help me see how much above and below I am, I notice that my second dot is actually 2 units above my first one. And the next one is 2 units above that. We also had another dot at -2, but it seemed on the last example that those dots might have been a bit closer than these others. And now that I have a y-axis, I can say that the second dot is 1 below, and the third dot is 2 below. So this is how having a second axis can really help us make sure we know exactly where points are located above or below that horizontal number line. So the coordinate plane and understanding its structure is essential to when it comes to graphing. And a lot of higher level math classes use the characteristics of the coordinate system to help make sense of various concepts. So understanding it now is important for all future high-level math classes. Thanks again to Slides Go for helping me with this presentation.